Thank you, Georgia Ann. Thank you to everybody at ADAH for hosting me. Scotty and Steve and the whole crew have been so welcoming, and especially thank you to you all for braving the cold weather today and coming out to take a deep dive at this particular work in the collection here. If you haven't noticed it upstairs, I'm sure many of you have, it's what I consider a wonderful part of the collection here, and I will tell you the story about this portrait over the next 40 minutes or so. So the artist of this work is, and excuse me, I'm battling a cold, so might be clearing my throat now and again. Anyway, the early 19th century artist Ralph E.W. Earl is the portrait of this particular portrait, and I believe that this is one of the most significant of the dozens, yes, dozens of portraits that Earl created of Jackson, and it's significant for a number of reasons. First, we know its exact history, and for a Southern painting, especially an early 19th century Southern painting, that is so rare that we're able to trace it. It's documented from the time that Henry Rutledge commissioned it in Nashville from Earl shortly after he arrived in Nashville. It's a Nashville portrait. In 1817, so follow me on the path that this portrait took over the years. It passed from the original owner, Major Henry M. Rutledge of Nashville, to his son, Henry A. Rutledge, who moved to Talladega in 1835. That's when the portrait comes to Alabama. His daughter, Septima Sexta Middleton Rutledge, married a man named General John Horace Forney, and their daughter Emma Rutledge Forney married a man named Clarence Daggett. Daggett donated the painting to ADAH in 1906, and it's been here ever since then, for well over 100 years. And also, it has recently celebrated its 200th birthday. So also significantly, as I mentioned, it's one of the first paintings that Earl made of Jackson, and he would go on to represent Jackson dozens and dozens of times over the next 21 years. Earl also used this painting as the basis for a print, which you see here on the screen, which, as I will discuss, was specifically intended to bolster Jackson's bid in the presidential election of 1824, but more on that in a bit. This institution's portrait of Andrew Jackson, as I've said, is in my view, and as the title of my presentation suggests, a cornerstone of Ralph E.W. Earl's work and one of his most significant. The itinerant artist turned presidential portraitist used this early portrait of Jackson as a springboard to a lifetime of success as Andrew Jackson's personal portraitist. As I believe Earl's portraits of Jackson were used as a type of public relations type tool at a time before elected officials were generally worried too much about their image, or certainly before they were employing artists in such ways as they do today, and what Jackson ultimately did with Earl. Earl became the first full-time presidential portraitist, and his image helped cement political successes for Old Hickory, particularly in helping him get elected, I believe, and re-elected to the presidency. Earl tirelessly painted Jackson's portrait nearly nonstop from 1817 until his death in 1838, and much can be learned about early American politics and portraiture, as well as about the goals and methods of both Jackson and Earl through his large body of work, using this Rutledge portrait, as I call it, as a case study and considering it as perhaps the cornerstone of all the works. The painting depicts a bust-length view of Jackson wearing his general's uniform from his victorious defeat of the British in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, which occurred in January of 1815. It pictures a youthful and vibrant Jackson, despite his sickliness and emaciated frame at the end of a long and hard-fought war, with his signature dramatic coif seated before a plain, muted backdrop. That hair is something people are always interested in, and indeed he did have quite the mane. Apparently it was red in his younger years, although he's already graying by the time this portrait was made. And it was very curly, and he always brushed it down. So those of us with curly hair know the body issue can be a problem sometimes, and he owned it, and we can see that in his portraits. The quirky misplacement of one of the braids suspended from his left epaulette provides a hint of life and personality and distinguishes this portrait from the others. So you can notice this little braid here, kind of quirkily out of place. And this is the only painting that Earl did that features that. And you can see it again in the print, which I'll show you in a minute. But first, a little background on Earl, the artist. In 1817, which was the year of the commission of this portrait, was Earl's first year in Nashville. He arrived on January 1st into the burgeoning city after traveling over a year en route. He had been in Paris copying paintings at the Louvre alongside other American artists when the Battle of New Orleans of the War of 1812 occurred, which thrust Andrew Jackson into the national spotlight and sort of cemented his fame for the future. Earl was originally from New England. His father was a well-known colonial portraitist named Ralph Earl. This is an example of his father's work, a portrait of a man named Elijah Boardman who owned a textile shop, and you can see the beautiful textiles that he offered in the background of the painting. This painting was done in 1789. Earl was born in 1788, by the way. So by the time he was born, his father was painting itinerantly in the Connecticut River Valley and in western Massachusetts. Earl's mother, Anne, and his sister Mary settled in a boarding house in Troy, New York, long before this. And Earl, after he had come of age just a bit as a very young boy, began traveling itinerantly with his father. So mother and sister were home in Troy at a boarding house, and I think essentially separated from the father based on scant records. But young Earl was traveling with his father, staying at inns and boarding houses or in the houses of the patrons for whom he was working, and this was his earliest training. Evidence of the influence of his father is there throughout the rest of Earl's life, even though his father died in 1801 when young Earl was about 13 years old. So he died of alcoholism, and he was in a state of decline for several years before that. So it's sort of remarkable that Earl gained some pretty important skills from his father just by kind of shadowing him in those early years. After Ralph Earl died of alcoholism, the younger Earl settled in Troy, New York, in order to help support his mother and his sister. And here we see an advertisement of his, young Earl's, studio, which he opened in Troy, New York, which he advertises bust, half-length, and full-length portrait painting by Ralph E.W. Earl, and this is in the July 8, 1806 Troy Gazette newspaper. He took an ad out similar to this many times and over a number of years. He stayed in Troy from the time he was an early teenager up through about age 19. And during that time, he was able to develop such a following and save enough money from his portraits that he funded a trip to Europe. So he was able at about age 18 or 19 to travel to London, which most aspiring young American artists sought to do to receive formal training. He studied there under two of the best known American expatriate artists, Benjamin West and John Trumbull. He stayed, as his money lasted, for a year in London before he moved to Norwich, England in 1810. Staying in Norwich for 4 years. Norwich was his mother's hometown, and through contacts between his mother and his father, he was able to gain a large following in Norwich and great success. Pretty remarkable for a man who had kind of self-funded from age 13. So the final year, 1815, saw him spending time in Paris. He was copying paintings at the Louvre, like I said, working alongside other American artists, and finally decided to come back home so he could hopefully become the famous portraitist of a history painting of the Battle of New Orleans featuring Andrew Jackson. So in 1815, he left Paris, traveled to America, landing at Savannah, Georgia, which was the closest port to Nashville at the time. And it took him that next year till January 1st, 1817, when he arrived in Nashville, to get there to Nashville. So he spent about 6 months kind of finding his way and gaining patronage in Savannah, which was a very burgeoning, excellent city for an aspiring artist. And then he slowly kind of painted his way up through Augusta and into North Georgia, through Chattanooga, and finally up to Nashville. When he got to Nashville, he immediately sought to try to get to Andrew Jackson in whatever way he could. And of course, he succeeded in doing that. Here's an example of the work, before I get too far ahead of myself, an example of the work he was doing in New England as a teenager. So this is a portrait of Nathaniel Ruggles and Martha Ruggles, both in private collections today, and dated from 1804. These are pendant portraits. This was a popular format of portrait in the early 19th century in which husband and wife are painted on separate canvases, but they're inflected towards each other. They're clearly parallel, meant to be hung together. And a great example of young Earl's kind of naive style. He would draw from this style pretty heavily in his Tennessee works. New England at the time was experiencing what was known as kind of a commercial revival. Upper middle classes were commissioning portraits for the first time, and although a finished oil painting is not an inexpensive item, the market was expanding. At the same time, the market for these paintings was a population that was pretty conservative. And so Earl's, like I said, naive, kind of self-taught style fit very well in that burgeoning New England middle class and translated quite well to his work in Nashville. Excuse me. Upon his arrival in Nashville, Earl gained unprecedented success. He was probably the first experienced artist to visit Nashville, and he became the first resident artist of the city. So he was quite the man about town. He became very popular, and his records underscore that idea. During his first year in Nashville alone, Earl accepted commissions to paint an astounding 84 portraits of elite Nashvillians. By the way, 9 of those were depicting Andrew Jackson, and one of those 9 is the one that's in the collection here. So it's no wonder that his memorandum book from that year lists several of those 84 paintings as, quote, not finished as yet. He was working on them for a few years after that. But only the most financially well-off individuals in Nashville could afford an Earl portrait. An unframed portrait by him typically costs $50 in 1817 funds, with an additional $20 or more for the frame, depending on what style of frame you wanted. And he was ordering his frames from Philadelphia. He would keep several different styles on hand. Some of them were the most simple kind of wood frame, and others had turned molding and were gilded and could be quite elaborate. The one here is gilded yet simple, and I'm not sure if that's an original frame. I've just seen it upstairs. Anyway, if we want to equate that cost to today's dollars, a portrait alone would have cost about $1,000 in today's value, and if you include the frame, it would have been about $1,325, just FYI. So these were the upper classes that were affording these portraits. This is a bit later view of Nashville, by the way, but as I mentioned, the ADAH portrait was commissioned by Major Henry M. Rutledge, who was a prominent Nashville citizen and son of Edward Rutledge, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Henry Rutledge was a close friend of Jackson's, who went on to serve as an aide to Jackson in the Florida campaigns in 1821. Rutledge and Jackson were longtime friends and business associates, and he was at Jackson's side with their mutual friend and Florence, Alabama resident John Coffey at Jackson's wife Rachel's funeral when she died suddenly in 1829. This is an example of the type of portraits that young Earl was doing when of those 84 that were commissioned. Many of them looked like this. This is Anne Phillips Rogers Grundy. She's the wife of Felix Grundy, who was a senator from Tennessee in the early 19th century. But these portraits typically feature a very kind of standard, straightforward image of a wealthy but kind of subdued sitter against a plain background, sometimes with the presence of a chair. For our more mature ladies, he always covers their hair with a demure bonnet or some sort of head wrap, which he certainly does here, just as example. Major Rutledge's portrait of Jackson, like I've said, is among the first of a long list of portrait commissions on that 1817 memoranda book, and he paid $50 for it. That's written in the records. Earl also listed it in 1817 as not finished, and we do not know when he completed it, although I would surmise that he completed it sometime that first year, 1817, possibly 1818, as we know that Earl, after the mid-year, after about 6 months in Nashville, had become friends with Jackson and was almost constantly in his presence, living at times at the Hermitage and painting his portrait on a regular basis. Of the 9 portraits of General Jackson that Earl painted in 1817, Earl probably created at least 2 or 3 different originals from live sittings with Jackson at his home, the Hermitage, from which he made multiple copies. Having painted portrait copies before this, he had copied a portrait of George Washington while he was living in Savannah. He had also copied multiple portraits at the Louvre, including this portrait of Napoleon, which hangs in the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. And realizing the difficulty of keeping up with large numbers of portrait commissions he was receiving, Earl began in 1817 his long-standing practice of making copies or similar versions of his original portraits to satisfy the great demand. He continued this practice for the entirety of his career, and it's often difficult to determine which paintings are copies and which paintings are from life, or which paintings are somewhere in between. So what I mean here is that Jackson was regularly and increasingly sitting for portraits from Earl. We don't have great records of which portraits were taken from those live sittings and which portraits were copies of those live sitting portraits. People in the day and still now consider those paintings from live sittings to be the most valuable. But there's some gray area, and pinning down the exact nature of most of Earl's many paintings is very difficult, because although we have records for 1817 and 1818 of the portraits that he painted, there are no more after that. It seems that he got super busy and was so well supported by Jackson, or perhaps they're missing if he did keep records. It's just information post-1818 is very scant for these works. So the Rutledge portrait belongs to a group of 3 very similar works that Earl painted of Jackson during his first year in Nashville. As you can see, they all look very similar, and these portraits are owned by the National Portrait Gallery, the Hermitage, and the ADAH, respectively. Both the National Portrait Galleries and the Hermitage's versions have tiny hints of battlefield activity in the background. While the work that now hangs in the Hermitage depicts 4 mounted soldiers to Jackson's right, you can make those out. The 4th one's cropped, but in the original painting there is 4 there. Only one of the soldiers rides horseback in the Portrait Gallery's painting, which you see here. So you can see one maybe equestrian officer with other soldiers on the ground below. The changes are only minor shadowy details, however, and Jackson's appearance is very similar in both works, and in fact in all 3 works, with only minor differences noticeable most blatantly in his hair. The ADH version, which I also call the Rutledge portrait, has a plain backdrop, but is distinguished by that wayward fringe that I noted before. There is also a 4th version about which very little is known. It's owned by Historic Deerfield in Massachusetts, but I do not believe this to be an Earl work. I believe it's a copy of the Rutledge work by another artist, about whom there are records painting a copy of an Earl Jackson named George P.A. Healy. So we aren't considering this among the 1817 Earl paintings of Jackson, but he copied the fringe, that wayward little epaulette braid, which you can see. This grouping of portraits might be considered the first truly successful images of Jackson that had ever been made. Earl was among the first artists to depict Jackson. A couple made in the wake of the Battle of New Orleans predate Earl's works, but are much less convincing. This work by French artist Jean Villay makes Jackson look like a youthful Frenchman. And Nathan Wheeler's awkward depiction is far from realistic. While all three artists pictured Jackson in his New Orleans military uniform, only Earl created an accurate likeness. Over the years, Jackson endorsed Earl's work in his correspondence. For example, he praised one of Earl's 1820 portraits, saying that it is perhaps, quote, a more correct likeness of myself than you have ever seen. Although it's impossible for us to know how accurate these actually were, Earl's portraits were regularly complimented as exceptional likenesses of Jackson, and they were overwhelmingly well received, especially in Nashville, where Jackson was very popular. Jackson's friend Isaac Baker, one of Earl's earliest, according to Jackson's friend Isaac Baker, one of Earl's earliest portraits of Jackson, it was considered, quote, the most accurate likeness I have ever seen of that extraordinary man, to give you a sense of the 19th century praise that was heaped on these works. By adding shadowy details in the depiction of the militiamen against the dark, cloudy sky and the equestrian soldiers, Earl directly alluded to Jackson's past heroic actions. It is both sensible and significant that in his earliest images of Jackson, Earl showed him in military dress. Jackson's coat in all three versions of this picture is probably the uniform he actually wore in the Battle of New Orleans, which is now in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. Jackson was depicted wearing the coat in many Earl paintings, and it was one of the main attractions at the Hermitage throughout Jackson's life. People loved to go and see this military coat. It was presented to the U.S. government in 1845, the year of Jackson's death. Jackson's identity in 1817, at the time these portraits were painted, was completely bound up with his status as a U.S. commanding general. In the bleakest wartime period, Jackson's resounding victory in New Orleans seemingly rescued the nation, once and for all, from Great Britain's grasp and firmly established independence. Jackson was celebrated as a national hero nationwide, and January 8th became Jackson Day. January 8th was celebrated as another version of July 4th, especially in the South. Earl had gone to Nashville specifically to paint the war hero, and was at the time he painted Jackson's first images, like this one, probably still endeavoring to use a Jackson portrait within his planned grand history painting of the victory at New Orleans. He also found, upon his arrival in Nashville, that there was huge demand for portraits of Jackson and images of others as well. Earl also already had plans to print Jackson's image, and this simple portrait would serve all of Earl's personal causes quite well. The multiple commissions for Earl's early composition demonstrate its success and helped prepare Earl for his most ambitious work to date. Yes, that's this one here on the screen. This is a life-size, full-length image of Jackson on the battlefield that Earl began for himself, not on commission, in 1817, the year he arrived in Nashville. Earl painted this to hang in his museum that he was opening in downtown Nashville. In addition to all of his portrait painting, Earl operated the Nashville Museum, and this was one of the first museums in what was known as the Western Country at that time. And it was a place of exhibition for his paintings and also other, as he called them, natural and artificial curiosities. So Earl and others gathered all sorts of interesting and we might think crazy things from around the state, including artifacts from Native American mounds and lots of other curiosities for this museum, but the walls were lined with his portraits, and this one was at the end wall of the room, kind of as the star of the show. This life-size portrait of Jackson attracted lots of attention, being exhibited in Earl's museum. For example, on a visit to the city in 1823, 12-year-old Thomas C. Jones wrote in astonishment to his mother that, quote, "I have today been to the Nashville Museum and I saw a painting of General Jackson that's as big as he is." For a sense of scale, here's a picture of me from this summer in front of that portrait hanging in the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. Like this work, all of Earl's first portraits of Jackson depict him as an American general in that famed coat, and in this case, on the battlefield. In portrait after portrait, for the first half dozen or more years of this patron-artist relationship, this is how Earl represented him, and this is how Jackson was known to the American people, as that heroic general who was celebrated on Jackson Day. From the very beginning of his work with Jackson, Earl had planned on commissioning prints based on his portraits for wider distribution than a singular portrait could see, even if that portrait was painted multiple times, which he was doing. He wrote several times about his idea to create and distribute prints of his Jackson portrait. For example, he wrote to his mother on September 21st, 1821, quote, "In June next, I shall take shipping from New Orleans for New York with a full-length portrait of General Jackson to be engraved in that city." So by this time, Earl had painted a second life-size portrait of Jackson that he wanted to use as the basis for his first Jackson print. He took that painting to New Orleans, where Jackson, of course, was the hero, to exhibit it, but rather, as he told his mother, he had planned to take it to New York where the engravers were to have it printed. He actually ended up being able to sell it to the city of New Orleans for the astounding sum of $1,000. Now, I'm not showing you a picture of that image, and I have no idea what it looks like because it has been lost or destroyed. So we don't have that painting. I wish we did. As it turns out, Earl based his first major print project on the Rutledge portrait. Here you're looking at that print. This finally came to fruition in advance of Jackson's first presidential run. Earl was heavily involved in the promotion of Jackson from the very beginning. The two became intimate friends. He supported his endeavors wholeheartedly. Jackson referred to him as his loyal friend. He was there seemingly at every turn. So his portraits supported Jackson, but Earl supported Jackson in many other ways as well, which we can talk about later. But by the time of Jackson's 1824 campaign, Earl was firmly embedded within the Jackson circle and within his family, actually. After spending so much time at the Hermitage in 1817, Earl actually married one of Jackson's nieces. She was Jane Caffery, was her name, and she was one of Rachel's nieces who was living at the Hermitage with her aunt. With Earl having married into the family, Jackson became especially close with the artist. He was considered an incredibly loyal man, especially to his family members. And so that helped cement this kind of lifelong relationship between the two men. They went on to have a really devoted friendship for decades, and Earl actually spent most of the rest of his life living under Jackson's roof. Unfortunately, Jane Caffery tragically died in childbirth along with Earl's son only a year into their marriage, and Earl remained a widower for the rest of his life, really devoting all of his efforts to the shaping of Jackson's identity through portraiture. This evolved into a coordinated attempt on his part to use his portraits in an attempt to help secure the election for Jackson, and that's my opinion. But it was Rutledge's portrait that was selected as the basis for his first print, which was brilliantly targeted at his first presidential election. So conveniently, a young but experienced printmaker had moved to Nashville from Salem, Massachusetts, named Charles Cutler Torrey. He's the engraver of this portrait, and he had moved there in 1823. So Torrey partnered with Earl, borrowed Rutledge's portrait, and used it as the basis for this large engraving. And this engraving is very impressive, especially for a work that came out of Nashville, which was a very small town at the time. And based on its scale, it was over 14 by 16 inches. So this was a very large, fine portrait print engraving. Painting and print side by side here. It seems likely that Earl and Torrey hoped to have the print available to support Jackson's presidential bid of 1824. Unfortunately, it wasn't completed in time for the presidential race. And only after 2.5 years of work on it did Torrey finally publish the finished engraving in 1826. Engraving is a meticulous, slow, and laborious medium, and this, as I've mentioned, was a very ambitious project. The finished print, however, is quite impressive, especially for a young printmaker in such a remote location. An inscription on the finished picture reads, and you can see that there at the bottom here, Andrew Jackson, engraved by Charles Torrey from an original picture by R.E.W. Earl in the possession of H.M. Rutledge, Nashville, Tennessee, published June 1st, 1826. Jackson had actually lost the 1824 election by the narrowest of margins, and there's no use in speculating what difference a printed portrait might have had on the election's painfully close outcome, but based on the creation of this print, there is evidence that even at this very early stage in Jackson's national political career, Earl was aware of the power of Jackson's image and the importance of using it in these kind of directed and even propagandistic ways. Although very little is known about the specifics of this print, there are no records about it. We don't know how many print copies were made of it. It certainly helped fill that demand for images of Jackson. Unfortunately for Torrey, it was one of his last engravings because he died only a year later of a fever in 1827. And publication did not occur until after the election. Even so, the production of such a large, fine portrait engraving in Nashville, especially in the 1820s, is remarkable. It's also unknown what financial gain Earl saw from the project, but publication was beneficial enough that he continued after this to spearhead other reproductions in the coming years. So I'll review those for you just briefly here in a minute. Printmaking was actually, I think, a brilliant way for Earl to satisfy the demand for Earl's portrait, for him to allow people who couldn't afford a Jackson original an example of Jackson to hang on their walls, and also a way to bolster Jackson's image. Earl could not keep up with demand for finished oil on canvas portraits, so these prints helped him meet that demand. And although as a member of the planter elite, Jackson and his cronies could afford those originals, most people in Nashville could not. So this allowed for kind of a more democratic art-making market. There was also already a long tradition of hanging works like these in people's homes. It's very well known and well documented that prints of George Washington regularly hung over the fireplaces in people's houses around the country. And so the widespread availability of prints of Jackson served all of these various purposes. The election of 1824 was not an easy one. Earl's presence on the ticket was divisive, and voters tended to either love or hate him. Although political cartooning did not begin in earnest until the 1828 election, in part because of the wider availability and quicker technique of lithography, several printed attempts and also verbal attacks were made during the 1824 contest to characterize Jackson as unfit for office. Earl probably hoped to have Torrey's engraving of this early image of Jackson available to voters as a countermeasure to these cartoons, but like I've said, the print was not ready in time. Among the most notorious Jackson caricatures is this, a profile image by printmaker James Aiken that, when inverted, appears to be a jackass, and it's called The Man, the Jackass, it's the title. So quite clever by James Aiken, the caricaturist, but one of the many ways of negatively personifying Jackson, and one of the most popular became the Jackass, and perhaps this was a play on his name. Jackson's hard-fought presidential races, particularly that of 1828, were among the first to involve full-scale personal attacks on the candidates by adversaries, of whom Jackson had many, and harsh criticisms came frequently in the form of widely circulated caricatures. The most widespread example became known as the coffin handbills. There are several versions. This is one of them that you see here. And these criticized Jackson's violent actions against his own troops in the Seminole Wars. No president before Jackson had been as repeatedly or bitterly attacked by cartoonists. Jackson's devoted friend, John Eaton, who was a leader of one of his election committees, wrote to him that, quote, "I am aware that no man in this country, living or dead, has been abused to the extent you have." Of course, many of the critiques against Jackson were well-founded, and his actions against Native Americans is unthinkable. But he was not criticized as harshly at that time for his violence against natives, but rather for things like his temper, what was seen as his monarchical ambition, his unfitness for the highest office, and untold numbers of anti-Jackson prints were produced which attacked everything from his war record to his unfit personality to his marriage. In many ways, Jackson seemed to be the direct opposite of those men who had preceded him in office. Jackson was, of course, the first president from beyond the original American colonies to be elected and to have risen to high office from a lowly background. He would also become the first president not directly associated with the Founding Fathers. His ascension to the top was especially trying, and he faced great political opposition exacerbated by his outsider status and contrast between him and his predecessors. Earl's visual record of Jackson, which was consciously made available to a large audience through his prints he commissioned after his paintings, thus served as a rebuttal to the attacks on Jackson's character. Jackson ran for the presidency again in 1828, this time successfully. Earl's prints came to not only serve as a visual counterpoint to all of those attacks on Jackson, both in word and visual form, but also Jackson deliberately utilized Earl's prints to encourage a positive, heroic public image of himself as a legitimate American political leader. This time, Earl doubled his efforts, and for this print, he changed his MO. After years of representing Jackson wearing his military uniform, Earl now showed him for the first time as a private citizen. And by the way, this is based on another portrait as well, which is lost. We don't have the original portrait here. But Earl here has removed his military jacket, shown him to be dignified, even presidential, and Earl commissioned, instead of a local printmaker, one of the best known engravers in the United States, Philadelphian printmaker James Longacre, to produce this print, and he began much earlier in advance of the election this time. He entered into a lengthy correspondence with Longacre. He began to advertise the print nationwide in order to publicize it and drum up business, and he took orders of the print in advance of its publication from around the country. The prints cost $5 each, and among Earl's list of Nashville subscribers was his friend and supporter, Major Rutledge. So we know Major Rutledge also purchased this second print, and we can see his name in red there on Earl's list of subscribers. Hundreds and hundreds of these prints were produced and sold nationwide just in time for the election. And Jackson was indeed elected to the presidency in 1828. He assumed office in January 1829, and he did this in the midst of mourning his beloved wife, Rachel, who had died suddenly just the month after he was elected in December 1828. So he was a lonely widower in Washington and sought the presence of his close friend Earl, who was working in Nashville. After multiple attempts to convince Earl to come move to Washington, Earl finally did this in the summer of 1830. And after moving into the White House and continuing to paint now President Jackson's portrait in order to meet demand at a seeming breakneck pace, Earl attained a great reputation in Washington, D.C. as a friend, supporter, and the portraitist of the president. So this is one of the first examples of President Jackson that Earl painted upon moving to D.C. Jackson's re-election campaign of 1832 found Earl commissioning yet another major print production of Jackson based on his paintings. Based on one of his paintings. The portrait here, casually known as Farmer Jackson, was painted on that summer of 1830, in which Jackson had visited his home of the Hermitage, and Earl painted him on his land. The portrait is more romanticized and more elaborate than any of the other prints and portraits we had seen up to this point. And it seems that Earl was trying to establish Earl's reputation as a member of the planter elite. So this was produced as a print just in time for the 1832 election, in which Earl was also successfully re-elected. And here we see the portrait. This time it's a lithograph, which is a slightly quicker and different process than the engravings that we had seen before. And it was commissioned from the Pendleton firm, lithographic firm in Boston, and produced by one of his apprentices, John Henry Buford. In the last 4 years of Jackson's presidency, Earl began seeking to establish his reputation for posterity. So he changed his portrait production and had thought about producing a grand scale portrait for that would kind of help cement Jackson for posterity. He wanted an equestrian portrait originally, and this is a small study portrait that hangs at the Hermitage today. He never created the grand equestrian portrait based on this image. Perhaps the Napoleonic correlation that may have been made by such an image was sought to be avoided by Earl, and instead he turned to more traditional portraiture in creating this work, which became known as the National Picture. Hangs in the National Portrait Gallery today, and this was the final work Earl created of Jackson in the office of the presidency. After the presidency ended, Earl returned to Nashville, home to the Hermitage with Jackson, and continued to refine his legacy. He continued spearheading Jackson portrait projects and was in the process of commissioning a print after this national picture of Jackson. In the late summer heat of Tennessee, he was working to help Jackson plant the trees. Oh, and I show you this Gilbert Stork here to remind you of the presidential style portrait upon which Earl had decided to draw for Jackson's image for posterity. Excuse me, just moving ahead here for the sake of time. Anyway, in the late summer heat of Tennessee, he was working to help Jackson plant trees along his famous guitar-shaped driveway, which you see here, when he suffered heat stroke from which he never recovered. He died a few days later, quite suddenly, September 16th, 1838, at age 50, with an incomplete portrait of Jackson on his easel. Jackson was devastated by his death, about which he wrote, "Earl's death is a severe bereavement to me, and he was my sincere friend and constant companion. He was an invaluable friend, a most upright and honest man." Earl is buried in the Jackson family cemetery alongside his friend Andrew Jackson, who died 7 years later in 1845. As one of the first of dozens of paintings of Jackson then, the Rutledge portrait and print became one piece of a much larger and evolving story in the history of Earl, Jackson, and presidential portrait making. Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, and if you will just raise your hand, Scotty, or I will pass you a microphone.
It's a two-part question. Was there many other politicians besides Andrew Jackson who became so involved with the painter that it almost became like his personal painter that, you know, to showcase him? And you always kept referring to the artist as Earl. Did he go by his last name opposed to Ralph more than that?
Very good questions. So she's asked how Earl was referred by his friends, and indeed he went by Earl. All the letters to him are addressed Earl. Early on in their friendship, Jackson called him Colonel Earl. He just kind of designated this title on him. And then later he even referred to him sometimes as Major Earl, even though Earl had no military association. But Earl was his nickname. And maybe that was to distinguish him from his father, who was also named Ralph Earl, and who was a very famous colonial portraitist. The first question was about whether or not other presidents have done such things, and I really don't think so. Now, Kennedy had, of course, advancing in time, was the first to have a kind of live-in or full-time employed photographer in the White House, and a lot has been made or written about his photographs and that relationship, but there really isn't an equivalent to this story. That might lead you to question why, and of course I think there wasn't another president that really needed the type of visual bolstering that Jackson needed for all sorts of reasons. And so Earl, it was this kind of unique combination of a portraitist who could bring some respectability to Jackson's circle as a European-trained gentleman who spoke French fluently and who was known as an upstanding citizen, and then also a family member. So Jackson really did consider him a family member, but the intimacy of their friendship ran very deep, I assure you, and it's a unique story in the history of the presidency as far as I'm concerned.
Did he ever take on any students or mentor any other artists while he was in Nashville?
Oh, that's a really great question. Not really. It was very remote, and there were not a lot of artists even passing through Nashville at the time Earl was there. However, maybe you've heard of the Coopers, Washington, Bogart, and William. They're two Tennessee portraitists, and their style very closely mimics that of Earl. It seems that Earl sort of set the precedent or set the standard style of 19th century portraiture for Tennessee, and perhaps that's because he painted everybody who was everybody. But I think the Coopers reached out to him and he may have even offered them a little instruction, nothing formally. But then when Earl moved to Washington in DC, it left a huge gulf in terms of a resident artist in Nashville, and it was the Cooper brothers that sort of filled that gulf. But I can't find any kind of formal relationship there. So not really, and I think partially that's because he was so busy. He was operating this museum and digging in Native American mounds and producing portraits of everybody.
Is it an Earl that's being used in the White House now?
It is. So the two most famous places today you would see the Jackson painting is on the $5 bill. That's not an Earl, that's a Sully. And of course, behind Trump in the White House. The White House Historical Association has owned that portrait since maybe the 1970s, and I know nothing about it. There's no provenance or history. I don't know which portrait of Jackson that one is, but it's one that pictures Jackson as president. He's wearing his really famous and dramatic silk red-lined cloak in that painting, and Earl produced lots and lots of images along that sort while he was working in the White House. See if I can find that cloak. There you go. He's wearing that, but it's just a bust-length view. But it's interesting that it was selected to sit right behind the desk of Donald Trump.
I noticed in the picture of Napoleon, his epaulette is also has an errant braid.
Oh my goodness, I have never noticed that.
I just wondered,
I have never noticed
had
that.
it become a trademark of the artist?
I gotta find it. Where is it?
There
There.
he is, there. See?
I can't tell you how many years I have stared at these portraits, and I just didn't look. And Earl claimed that this was an original portrait. He claimed Napoleon sat for him when he visited Paris. I doubt that. I have no evidence either way. It looks to me like an Ang portrait or something, one of the French portraits of Napoleon, but oh my gosh, that has to be where he got it, right? I always just thought it was a quirky misplacement. He painted this first. So this is he painted this in Paris late 1814, 1815, and then the Rutledge is 17. Thank you.
If he painted other people, if there might be little.
Oh, she's wondering if this became a trademark for Earl. Well, I can't say because I clearly don't always notice, but I haven't seen it. Have y'all? They weren't. Oh, good.
All right, well, thank you again, Dr. Stevens, and for everyone being
Thank
here today.
you.
And there are copies of the book available for purchase, and she will be around for a little bit to sign them and chat with you. So thank you again.